Heather McDonald, what a pleasure. Thanks for talking to me today about your fantastic new book. I finished it last night, When Race Trumps Merit, a wonderful, wonderful new book. I'm going to suggest that we do something very different. I listened to your interview with Jordan Peterson. I listened to your interview with Brendan O'Neill, and I've listened to your interview with, I can't remember, some Christian woman. I can't remember his. And of course, I've read your other stuff. So here's what I'm going to suggest that we do. Instead of this being a mutual agree love fest, I'm going to pretend to be a woke person. And and I'm sure that people are going to cut this out and meme it and to try to get me in all sorts of trouble. But I am going to go through.
This doesn't get you in trouble. I'm the one to be in trouble. So.
True. After having read your manuscript, I can genuinely say that is actually true. The thing about your manuscript is just overwhelming data. I mean, it's just meticulously sourced and a mountain of everything. There is no dispute of the data, and so that's not. I'm going to just try something new. So I do want to acknowledge that might get frustrating for you. I'm not going to be woke in the sense of, screaming or screeching or calling you a Nazi, but I am going to try to adopt the mindset and the ideological worldview of a, I don't want to say sane woke person, that wouldn't be quite accurate, but of someone who's bought into the ideology hook, line, and sinker. Okay. So, and I'm also going to try to stay in character the whole interview. Okay. We're going to have like a safe word. Like if I say red, that means I'm out of character, but I'm going to try to stay in character the whole It's kind of like the opposite of a safe word. Safe, this, I'll get back to sanity, and so it's probably going to do me some cognitive and epistemological damage to do this role play, but it's worth the sacrifice.
Well, I agree that red is out of character. I think the phrase cultural Marxism is wrong and so overused. So if you're in fact red, it means you're not current lefty.
Very good, touche.
I much prefer a good old-fashioned Marxist to the current you've got down. So I'll listen for red when I can.
Okay.
Your artillery fire.
Yeah,
so.
And I agree with the old Marxists because the rules of engagement are still relatively similar. Okay, so before we begin this exercise, we need to define certain terms, and I'm looking at your book, and I've highlighted certain words. In the subtitle of your book is equity. So let's make sure you and I are on the same page before we begin the role play. Define equity.
Equity in our current discourse is basically a synonym for racial proportionality. An institution that is not proportionally representative of underrepresented minorities such as Blacks and Hispanics, if it is not, say, 13% Black in a computer science laboratory or a cancer research lab, is per se not equitable. It would be equitable, that cancer research lab would be equitable if it had 13% Black oncologists.
Okay, so equity is proportional representation of minority groups.
That's what I see the cultural commissars charging constantly. Whenever they say there's a problem with equity, what they are inevitably referring to is the lack of proportional representation, and the source of that lack of proportional representation is inevitably some sort of meritocratic standard that has a disparate impact on minorities.
Okay. So we're in the same. We now. I have a different definition, but I'm gonna go with yours. Slightly different. So now we only need to define one more word, or actually maybe two more words. Define diversity and meritocracy, please, and then we'll begin.
Diversity is itself yet another euphemism for racial proportionality.
Okay.
It is a synonym for a desired ratio of underrepresented, underperforming minorities, Blacks and Hispanics, because Asians don't count as diverse. Here's another little translation key. Students of color, to be of color, is by definition academically underperforming. Many Asians on college campuses today yearn to be given the good housekeeping seal of approval of being of color, but they don't count because they're overperforming. So I would say diversity is another synonym for racial proportionality, and meritocracy, or a meritocratic standard, is one that is indifferent and blind to the trivialities of identity and is centered around the core competence that is necessary to succeed in a given institution.
Okay. All right. So we're on the same page, and now I'm going to be woke. Thank you very much, Heather, for joining me today on this edition of Woke in Authors. My first question to you, so I've read your book last night, and the first chapter, part 1, is Science and Medicine. And so you have two chapters. Chapter 1, which is Medicine's Racial Reckoning, and chapter 2 is How Diversity Subverts Science. So what is your basic argument for why equitable solutions based upon the definition you just gave are bad?
Because I don't think that race and sex are accomplishments. I don't think that they bear on the scientific project. Science is about the scientific method. It is not about the scientist. And any time that a job search or a irrelevant criterion is introduced into the reasons why one would select a candidate, mathematically, it's inevitable you're going to lower the quality of the candidates that you choose. In this case, the reason we're talking about equity or diversity at all is because we have vast academic skills gaps that mean that a colorblind system of credentializing, of admitting medical students, of promoting medical students, of hiring medical faculty, putting them on hospital boards, giving them research grants, a colorblind meritocratic set of processes will not produce anything remotely like racially proportionate outcomes. And so we have decided to substitute for an emphasis in what should be an exclusive emphasis on scientific qualifications, an attention to and a privileging of the trivialities of race and, to a certain lesser extent, sex.
Okay. Doesn't that assume that the goal of medicine would be to heal people?
It does.
Okay. Why would one accept that goal as opposed to having more people, more physicians, and I guess more broadly nurses as well, but let's just stick to physicians? Why is the goal of healing people superior to the goal of having more Black physicians?
Well, in that case, we might as well just give up any institutional goal and just say, from now on, every institution's only goal is to have proportional population within it. So let's give up universities, let's give up medicine, let's give up hearing.
And what's so one, what's wrong with that? And two, the idea is that if we did that in the long run, in the short term, it would be a catastrophe. If the goal of medicine is to heal people, but in the long run, it would give minorities role models to follow. For example, I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek, but Lieutenant Uhura was the Black communications officer on Star Trek, the original Star Trek, when I was a kid. I'm 56 when I grew up. And she was incidentally, the first interracial kiss between her and Captain Kirk. But she was thinking about quitting, and she went to Martin Luther King and talked to him. He said, no, it's absolutely vital that you don't quit, that you stay on the show. And the idea is that it shows black characters or black people in positions of authority. Could the argument not be made that in the long term, if one accepts that the goal of the hospital is to heal people, then in the long term, that goal would better be served by having more underqualified minorities, because that would give young people who are black an aspiration when they see people who look like them in positions of authority, and over time that would yield better outcomes.
Well, I have to say, Mr. Leftist, you're speaking in a more explicit and transparent way than most people. I am not an actual leftist if you're actually conceding that we would be admitting underqualified people. So I suspect there's a ruse going on, but assuming that you're not a plant, that's a preposterous argument, but it is the argument laid bare that we're supposed to accept, which is that medicine is about a non-medical goal, that the comparative advantage of doctors is not healing people or not advancing our knowledge of lethal diseases, but is somehow being social workers or being social justice warriors. No, I'm sorry. I believe in the theory of comparative advantage, that it is, let me just state, it is not doctors' comparative advantage to be social workers. If you want to be a social worker, go to social work school. Don't waste mostly taxpayer money becoming a doctor. So I don't accept your premise that the goal for the short term should be equity. And the other problem is that your trajectory, which is that if we accept lowering credentials now, that somehow over the long term we won't need to do that any longer, unless we look head on at the vast academic skills gaps. And Mr. Leftist, I just want to show you what those are, if I may, for a moment.
Please.
These are kept very carefully off stage.
Please.
66% of Black 12th graders do not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills such as arithmetic or recognizing a linear function on a graph. Only 7% of Black 12th graders are competent in those basic 12th grade math skills. And the number of Black 12th graders nationally who are actually advanced in 12th grade math skills is too small to even show up.
Yeah, but you don't, in all fairness, you don't really need math to fix a leg that's broken.
Oh, I think you do. I think the capacity to absorb the extraordinarily, increasingly detailed and frankly, often numerically based medical knowledge is related to one's analytical capacity. If you can't do math, I really do not want a doctor who is deficient in mathematical skills. I don't know what else one would substitute.
Okay, let me give you what you're looking for.
But let me just say, I don't totally reject the role model argument.
Oh, okay.
I hate that argument. I hate it because it is a vicious circle. It means that in a field, let's just say we care about proportional representation, which I do not. But if we care that we need to have our pioneers, it means you can never break if you have a zero representation in any given field. You cannot break into it because there's no role models to follow. How did Marie Curie become an expert in radiation and radiology? Because there were no females before her. The way she did it was saying, my role models are radiologists or people who understand, the whole science of this field. I don't need a female role model. And that's the same for me. The idea that I need a female role model, if I were, say, a chess player, which I'm certainly not, I'm sad to say, is ridiculous. Or a physicist, how about I choose for my role model Albert Einstein? I think it is incredibly narrow to say that one can only aspire to follow in the footsteps of people who allegedly look like somebody.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and we haven't even gotten to part 2 yet. So you're probably familiar with President Biden, his comment that he was the next Supreme Court justice would be Black and female. Now, I'm going to make an argument by analogy. Oh, I'm not a lawyer, but it's my understanding from having read about this that only 2% of people who graduate from law schools are Black and female.
Right.
And so the likelihood that the most qualified people would already be in that 2%, the most qualified person, because you're only talking about one Supreme Court justice, that's just extraordinarily unlikely. It's highly improbable. But the goal was proportional representation. The goal was not, in fact, again, I'm going to give you what you're looking for. You couldn't possibly get you could possibly get. It's highly unlikely that you would get the best legal mind, given that you're only looking at 2% of any given graduating class. But the goal was not to get the best legal mind. The goal was to put a Black female on the Supreme Court. So that goal was overriding having the best person for the position. So why shouldn't that same reasoning be used in medicine or anything else? That the goal should not be to get the most qualified person for the job, but the goal should be to get a member of a group who has been historically oppressed in that position.
Because it's a scary, dangerous argument in both instances, whether it's jurisprudence or medicine. And I'm very glad, Mr. Lefty, that you brought up this example. I just want to fill out a little bit.
Please.
Your absolutely insightful elucidation of this example. Let me note that in February of 2021, when Biden was just taking over the White House, he let it be known that he was not going to submit his judicial nominees to the American Bar Association for their traditional rating of those nominees. You know, traditionally, the president makes his choices and he submits it to the ABA relevant committees on the federal government. And they have a grading system of very qualified, or not so qualified. And Biden said, I'm not going to do that because the ABA is not sufficiently interested in or attuned to the necessity of diversity. Now,
right.
if your listeners are in such a bubble, they don't know this, let me just say, the ABA for the last several decades is obsessed with diversity. It is all they talk about.
Correct.
They're about to get rid of the LSATs.
Correct.
As a requirement to go into law school because they have the LSATs like every other standardized colorblind objective test has a disparate impact on Blacks. ABA is diversity 100%, 24 hours a day. So what Biden was saying is, my candidates are going to be so bad that they wouldn't even pass the test of the diversity besotted ABA. Now,
right.
So this means that this 2%, and I don't do the math here, but I think that probably a Black female as one of 9 Supreme Court justices would be way overrepresented because Black males are 6% of the U.S. population. So let's say Black females are about the same. I don't know what 1 in 9 is, but I suspect that the 1 in 9 is higher than 6%.
Yeah, but it would take into account previous historical, the fact there's been no female Black Supreme Court justices. So it would take proportional representation in historical context as well.
But I don't care about that. You know what? The solution is, if you believe that all of our skills gaps are the result of historical discrimination, which is not going on now. I could not agree more that historically this country was appalling in its mistreatment, gratuitous cruelty directed at Blacks, but that is not our reality today. The solution is not at the end of this process to say, okay, now we're putting mediocrities into situations that require competence. And I would just say, again, I I so applaud your comparison between medicine and jurisprudence. I think most people are quicker to worry about the lowering of standards in medicine, not you, Mr. Lefty, but anybody with a remote shred of common sense who cares about who walks through the door in the emergency room when he's brought in after a car crash.
Yeah.
But probably be less concerned about who's going on the federal bench. I would just say that's a big mistake. The quality of our jurisprudence matters enormously. It matters for the ability of people in the commercial field to plan, to have certainty of contracts, to understand, to believe that if they have a contractual dispute, they can go before a judge who has the capacity to read what are extremely complicated
For sure.
contractual relationships at this point. And it also matters in the field of constitutional law, where we are setting out the principles by which we govern ourselves. And the idea that we are accepting putting people on the bench that are not the best we can find for the sake of color coding is ridiculous. I'll tell you, Mr. Lefty, somebody was just telling me that he was observing an oral argument in the DC Circuit. This is the federal appellate court for the Washington, D.C. It's the second most prestigious court in the land after the Supreme Court. And there was a Obama appointee on the court and a Trump appointee and a Biden appointee. And the Biden appointee was patently out of her league. That to me is very worrisome.
Okay, so I'm going to bracket this because your book is so fascinating. I want to cover the rest of it, but I do want to come back to this idea of how should an outside external observer adjudicate between the arguments that you've made, and I don't want to mischaracterize you, but the arguments that you made were fundamentally meritocratic in their orientation, and the arguments that I made were fundamentally equity-based in their orientation. And so it's a clash of values. But I want to go on to, you write rather extensively in the book about culture and arts and classical music. So just, if I may, for everyone, Chapter 3, The Crusade Against Classical Music. Chapter 4, Scapegoats and the Rise of Meritocracy. Mediocrity, excuse me. Chapter 5, Making Beethoven Woke. Chapter 6, Can Opera Survive in the Culture Wars? 7, The Revolution Comes to Juilliard. 8, The Swamping of Swan Lake. 9, The Demise of the Docent. 10, Museums Apologize for Art. 11, An Art Museum Cancels Art. And 12, Abstainers. So a significant from 71 to 208. So let me present an argument to you and listen to what you have to say. So the fundamental assumption in this is that there's something intrinsically good about Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, basically dead white people. There's something fundamentally important about that, and that's worth preserving, as opposed to taking other. Well, first of all, do you agree with that?
Yes. Well, I will listen. I'm enough of a product of my deconstructive background that I actually fully understand the issue of canon formation.
Okay, that's where I was going.
In radical changes in the literary canon and in the musical canon. So I know that intellectually. I can see the rise and fall of John Dryden in literature. I can see the obscurity and then the massive meteoric rise of Gustav Mahler in the classical music canon. And bel canto opera was no longer performed for a long time, and then 20th century saw a major revival. So I will admit that tastes come and go. That having been said, as a visceral lived experience, there is no way you are ever going to persuade me that when I am listening to Bach's St. Matthew Passion, I am not listening to one of the most crushing, sublime human experiences of sorrow, grief, loss and ultimate catharsis that one can possibly have. You are never going to persuade me that when I listen to Brahms' late piano music, I am not following the trajectory of a human soul into areas of terrifying eros and longing and a sort of a love, a sexual attraction that is almost it's almost like you can't look on it like the face of a fury.
Have you ever listened to NWA or Two Live Crew?
What?
Have you ever listened to NWA or Two Live Crew?
Not knowingly. Whether I've been subjected to it in background in a CVS, I don't know.
Okay, so what if somebody has their unequivocal testimony, maybe not as articulate as you've put it, but that they get the same kind of feelings from that music that resonates with them, that's close to them? Isn't it just a matter of upbringing? And if we change the canon, if we decolonize the canon, and we put in people whose ancestors have been historically oppressed, wouldn't that create a more inclusive environment in the context of the part two, which is culture and arts?
Yeah, that's the fundamental issue, Mr. Lefty. And I absolutely admit to a conflict between my brain on the one hand and my heart and my feeling on the other. I am very, very aware of these arguments that all aesthetic experience is relative.
Right.
And yet I cannot give up an absolutely felt belief that it is possible to make aesthetic judgments. And I realize too that any criteria that you may come up with to justify one's own aesthetic preferences are completely vulnerable to the accusation that they are ad hoc. So I could spontaneously come up with a list right now that I think would distinguish the St. Matthew Passion from niggas with attitudes, whether it's complexity, harmonic complexity, melodic complexity, voicing, historical value, but that's at least compared to what is the routine, repetitious, and frankly barbaric significance of gangster rap. But you could say you're just coming up with an ad hoc series of criteria, and I will
post hoc. Yeah.
I would also say that I fully understand. There's lots of. I'm going to absolutely admit that gangster rap I find repellent, but there's lots of other non-classical music that is completely powerful.
Tool.
The whole history of the American songbook and big band song and American jazz, and God, it's America's contribution to world culture.
For sure.
Cole Porter and Gershwin and Irving Berlin. It's astounding. And I would say the same thing about blues, rhythm and blues, and a lot of folk traditions. I find the folk traditions of Eastern Europe with their amazing rhythmic complexity.
Okay. So let me ask if we can have a compromise. What if we kept one of Beethoven's songs, but threw out every other white composer and included more people from Africa? Would you be willing to make that we'll keep one song, one of Beethoven's pieces, and then we'll take songs and folk music and tribal music, and we'll change we'll also change the composition of the orchestra in terms of what instruments are used. Would that be a reasonable compromise?
No, it wouldn't be a reasonable compromise, Mr. Lefty. I guess I would also fall back on sort of historical integrity, that there are certain traditions that have evolved organically. And I have said before, I find one of the most compelling dramas in human experience, the evolution of style. This is something that is beyond fathoming. It is so incredible. you know, how you get from the style of the Gregorian chant through the grandeur nobility of 18th century high classicism with the symphonies and operas of Mozart, the symphonies of Haydn, and then into you know, the 19th century romanticism and into post-romanticism. That all those changes represent different ways of human beings expressing themselves. A whole new vistas of expression open up. The same thing is true in literary tradition, how you get from the medieval romantic epic, allegorical epic, into Augustan poetry, and then into the realistic novel, where allegory is left way, way behind, or in visual arts, same thing. It's all very amazing. So to artificially open up the Western classical tradition, which was this amazing discourse among different composers across the globe. You had people in Russia being influenced by what was going on in Italy or in...
Yeah, they're all still white, though, and they're all men. There are really no female conductors that I know of. I'm not really...
Oh, you mean composers? I don't care. No, there are. I mean...
No, conductors and composers, but conductors as well.
Well, now there's tons. I mean, now forget it if you're a white male. I'm always amazed when I see, my God, another white male has been put on a conducting post, but believe me, it's getting harder and harder. They'll soon be completely excluded from the podium, but conducting is sort of a sideshow. The issue is, are there female composers? And actually everybody goes nuts over Hildegard von Bingen, who's a medieval composer, but in the 19th century, there were quite a few, and they're actually not bad. Same with 20th century. So I don't mind that if they're within the tradition, but to have these artificial ceiling quotas, it's like keeping Jews out of the Ivy League. Sorry, it doesn't cut it with me. I would say the criterion should always be, is this music excellent? Does it expand our knowledge? And to bring in into the orchestra artificially instruments that were not part of it, I don't agree with. On the other hand, let me just say, I mean, one of the aspects of contemporary classical music is a greatly expanded percussion section. It is so world music-y, you wouldn't believe it. You know, there's like the entire back of the orchestra hall is one odd percussion instrument after another. So that is actually happening. So these are very good questions, Mr. Lefty, because it's a combination of organic evolution and then some deliberate evolution. And I guess I'm going to be very wishy-washy and say maybe I'm willing to tweak it a little bit here and there. And I recently, in fact, reviewed a concert at the New York Philharmonic that was explicitly race-based. It was about the theme of Black liberation. And I'll be honest, I went there expecting that I would write a pan, and I gave it a rave review. But that was because the composers were very good. William Grant Still, and I can't remember his name. Not Hailstorm.
I would know him anyway.
Almost Hailstorm, yeah. But they were very good. So I'm not as much of a fuddy-duddy as it may appear.
Okay, so this question has a very old pedigree, and it's about objectivity or subjectivity, and there's just something objective in beauty. But I'm gonna bracket that. We could literally talk, and people have written books about it and spent their whole lives thinking about that question. I wanted to situate that though in the context of the part 2 of your book, and now I want to go on to something that I've been thinking about a lot, because to be blunt, I never think about classical music. It just doesn't, totally uninteresting to me. Law and order. Now this is an astonishing part 3 that is truly meticulously documented. So chapter 13, A New Crime Wave; 14, The Road to Anarchy; 15, On Double Standards; 16, A Grim and Ignored Body Count; 17, Mass Shootings, Hate Crime and Race; 18, The Chauvin Trial and Its Aftermath. So before we delve into this, I'm going to accept by fiat, because I believe it's true, the data that you gave in the book. It corresponds to, I just wrote an afterword to The Gift of Violence, and I've been interested in this subject for quite a while. So I'd like to start by having a place upon which we can agree upon facts, evidence, and data. So would you please mind providing us some evidence before I offer a critique?
Well, the data shows that Blacks die of homicide at an extraordinarily high rate compared to whites. And contrary to what the Black Lives Matter narrative says, they're not being killed by the police. They're not being killed by whites. They're being killed by other Blacks. The Black homicide and shooting rate is correspondingly high. For instance, Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of homicide at 25 times the rate of whites. Now, one would think that that would be a civil rights problem that the Black Lives Matter activists would concern themselves with, but they don't at all. And the reason they don't is because those Blacks that are being gunned down at that 25 times higher rate are being gunned down by other Blacks. And it is absolutely taboo to talk about Black on Black crime. I remember when I was barely starting to write about crime, hearing the phrase Black on Black crime, and you don't hear it much anymore, but when you heard it, it was always in a context of opprobrium. The assumption was that's just an unfair term and it's a racist dog whistle. And well, why? It's a reality. And so we've got the 25 times rate. Well, the Journal of American Medicine recently came out with a study showing that what it called the first 18 months of the coronavirus epidemic, I will translate that as the post-George Floyd race riot era, Black juveniles, those under the age of 17, died of gun homicide at 100 times the rate of white juveniles. Now, anybody in statistics knows that those types of disparities rarely happen. And again, the people killing those Black juveniles are not white. If they had been white, we would have heard of every single one of those shootings, and we haven't. And who were the victims? They were 1-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 5-year-old Black kids gunned down in their homes, in their backyards, in their bedrooms, riding in their parents' cars, at birthday parties, jumping on trampolines.
Okay.
The carnage continues daily.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, please. The fact that we as a society cannot talk about or mention Black on Black crime, does that not mean that even mentioning Black on Black crime is more hurtful, more harmful, and more dangerous than dead Black people?
Yes, it means that the culture at large, not just the activists, would rather turn their eyes away from the pathological inner city culture that gives rise to these drive-by shootings than do anything about it. And, it occurred to me in the last couple months that it's very weird. If you were in a Rawlsian experiment of sort of the coming out with the initial state or whatever he calls it before we know
the original position,
we didn't know yet what Black activists, race activists would do. You could imagine them either supporting Black victims, crime victims, or Black criminals. And I would have bet on the if you're a Black civil rights activist, you would throw in your lot with Black crime victims. It's just the opposite. It turns out that they would rather protect Black criminals than protect Black victims.
Okay. So I want to linger on this because this is very important. You may be surprised by this, but I'm going to agree with you. So I think that there is overwhelming evidence that people don't care about this. For example, the incoming mayor to Chicago,
yes, absolutely,
has said that he wants to defund the police, and he's commented on the riots.
Yeah.
I can't remember what he said, but it's very, very vanilla response. Oh, it's just kids having, getting a little mischief or something, in which people were murdered. So my question to you then, Miss Righty or Miss Conservative, Ms. Excuse me, my question to you would be, we live in a democracy. People vote for their leaders. People have voted in the city of Portland, for example, which I've moved out of, for Ted Wheeler, he, him, who has turned or is actively turning the city into a giant cesspool. And so, or actually, excuse me, let me rephrase that. It was actively turning the city into a haven of social justice.
Yes, exactly.
So my question to you is, in democratic society, that's what people value. And so if that's what they value, then who are you to say that black on black crime or the murder of black people are bad when people have consistently voted against any kind of meaningful intervention? And again, just I can't remember the mayor's name.
Brandon Johnson.
Brandon Johnson. Thank you. And they have just elected him, and he's explicitly had it as part of his campaign platform to defund the police. So who are you to say?
Yep, you're absolutely right, and you're absolutely right, Mr. Lefty. I mean, and you say people don't care about this, and I think that you're using a euphemism. I think what the real pointed issue is Black people don't care about this, because Brandon Johnson, who did several years ago, was explicitly a defunder. Then he tried to walk that back a little bit, but he still is for moving enforcement into social service workers.
And who is Black, by the way. So it is.
Well, that's it.
This is not a white colonizer in there.
The highest vote for Brandon Johnson, who was much more left-wing on law enforcement than his opponent, Paul Vallas, another Democrat,
right,
in the runoff election. The highest vote counts and proportions for Johnson came from the highest crime neighborhoods in Chicago, which by definition are all Black. So you're absolutely right. At this point, I have said when white conservatives stop caring about Black victims, there's going to be nobody that gives a damn. Because
right. So the people in these communities, they're far less bothered by it than you, as evidenced by their way they vote. So I don't understand why this is a problem for you.
Well, I've made a point in my writing on the police to go into police community meetings and gatherings, and there are many law-abiding, vulnerable Blacks in high crime neighborhoods who do want the police, who are terrified, especially the elderly, and it breaks one's heart. They're scared to go out and go to the grocery store. They're scared to go into their building lobbies when those lobbies are colonized by trespassing youth hanging out, smoking weed and selling drugs. And I spoke to a cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who said, "Please, Jesus, send more police," because the only time she felt safe to go down was when the police, she said, as long as the police are there, everything's A-okay and you can go down. But otherwise, she's a prisoner in her own apartment. So I've tried to give voice to those people because they do exist and the New York Times never hears about them. But you're absolutely right that voting patterns would seem to be completely self-destructive. And they're also, voting patterns are not always consistent with polling data, because frequently, like white conservatives who like to say Black people really want law enforcement, it's sort of a safe harbor, will point to various polls that say there was a Quinnipiac poll in New York City.
Yeah, remember that.
That Black voters in New York, by a slightly higher margin, wanted the police to engage in more broken windows type policing than white voters. And yet, as you rightly and painfully point out, which is something that white conservatives don't want to acknowledge, when they actually come to vote, it's the usual racial pattern. And whether that's purely ethnic solidarity, which we've seen in this country since the Ellis Island era, or whether it's a ongoing embrace of victimology, and they want to vote for politicians that continue the idea that Blacks are victims of a white supremacist world, it's not really clear to me. And I would also say, in frustration, that there's almost a sense of lack of personal agency. There's really nothing we can do about it, which isn't to say that there are not groups in those communities that do go out and protest and try to organize the community around some sort of, we've got to talk about this, but frankly, nobody wants to talk about family breakdown. That is very unusual to hear. black.
Yeah, an adult male in the home in
Exactly.
particular. Yeah. Um. Okay. So there's just so much to talk about here, but would you agree with this statement? Let's see if we can find my friends in Australia have a channel. I was just in Australia and I did something with them. They're called Common Ground. Let's see if we can find common ground here. Would you agree that the capitalist system that we have inherited, banks and supply demand, et cetera, that is only made possible by, or that is sustained by the police force? So if you take away a police force, the idea that you could have private property would be jeopardized. I mean, I'm generalizing here. I suppose everybody could have a gun. It could be like the Wild Wild West, but that the police stand between the capitalist system and the people. And if you eliminate the police, you can be more positioned to undermine capitalism. Is that
That's certainly true. What we've seen with the rioting, the post George Floyd looting and rioting and mayhem, that when the police back down, and in fact, we're sort of seeing that. It's like we've been living a slow motion riot since
right
since the George Floyd race.
Okay,
riot.
but is that not a form of equity? I mean, is it not a form of equity when people of color can rob a store? Because before they couldn't rob a store, and only white people were robbing stores. So what was it? Is it not a form of a kind of redistribution along racial lines to impoverished people? And if you take,
I love this. Oh, thank you for the impoverished people, Mr. Lefty. I love that. Which takes me back. I will inform your readers of what exactly Brandon Johnson said after the flash mob marauded down the Magnificent Mile recently in
Yes.
the annual rite of passage for South Side, West Side youth.
Yes.
He said, well, what's really going on here is these poor people have been denied of opportunity.
Right.
And
Equity.
safe places to gather in their communities. Denied opportunity. These flash mobs are organized by smartphone on social media. These kids all have smartphones. They are not deprived of opportunity. The problem in America is obesity. Nobody is starving to death. They all have the latest sneakers. They are living lives of affluence that far outstrip anything that Louis the XIV had, except for maybe amount of jewels, but who knows about that with bling. So this is not a question of being deprived of resources.
Okay, maybe he misspoke.
And entitlement.
Okay, maybe he misspoke, but certainly you would admit that this is a form of equity.
No, it's not. Who's it equitable for? The minority, the Indian Pakistani who's in his deli just trying to survive with his kids, and meanwhile he's got this marauding group.
No, I don't consider them to be in the category of diverse given academic performance. I mean, historically, it was white people who were rioting. Black people didn't really have that much of an opportunity to riot. So why can't we apply an equity lens to this and say this is an opportunity for people whose ancestors have been historically marginalized, that they have the opportunity to riot?
Well, that would be good, because then all the goodies would stop. So if there's no security of property, all those smartphones that these kids are using to organize their riots would be much less available until they possibly disappear. So we'll see what happens. We're sort of moving in that direction with all these stores now closing down, because they would rather close down and deny their customers of their prescription drugs if they're a Walgreens or CVS than make arrests for shoplifting, because when they do, they will be accused of racism because the people they're arresting for shoplifting
correct,
are disproportionately black.
Correct, but wait a second.
Security of property and see if the goodies start.
Okay, let me pause you. Sorry to interrupt, but this is important. So I still am a little foggy why that is not an example of equity.
I guess it is an example of equity. You're
right.
It
is an example of equity. And if the zeitgeist now is equity, and if the Biden administration has placed equity at every level of there are literally equity offices in the second debate with Trump, he was asked about equity. He didn't know the difference between equity and equality. Bernie Sanders was asked on Bill Maher. He doesn't know what equity is, although it's one of his on his webpage as his pledges. Just anecdotally, all the emails I get from my kids' school, constant equity. The whole society is consumed by equity. So when we see instances of riots and we see instances of Joe Biden's, getting back to what we said previously in the discussion, of his cabinet is from more minority groups, etc. And I think I tweeted out, what a remarkable coincidence. The most qualified people just happen to come from the most disenfranchised groups. You could say a lot of things about that. You could say you disagree with it. You could say, like we see equity in sentencing now, criminal sentencing. We see equity in the police not wanting to be considered racist. So it's a kind of mass Ferguson effect. So that they don't police in high crime, specifically black neighborhoods. You can say a lot of things about that morally, but you cannot say that is not equitable.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the sort of the hard version and the soft version, or the hot version and the cold version. So you have the soft, cold version, which is the racial preferences and the institutional,
right?
So elevations of mediocrities, and then you've got the hot,
right,
which is the looting and the rioting.
Okay,
not entitled.
Okay, so we have common ground here. We completely agree that in both of the hot and the cold, this is a form of equity. Now let's take it to another stage. We voted in somebody who was very explicit on their presidential page that they were going to institute equity. We knew exactly what we were getting into. People consistently vote. Now, if this were someplace else, if this were North Korea or Iran, okay, we would have a different conversation. But this is clearly what people want. Clearly. They want equity, and they're getting equity. They don't want meritocracy. If they wanted meritocracy, they wouldn't consistently vote in people, the superintendents of school systems, school boards, everybody, equity, doctors, American Psychological Association, woke, Scientific American, woke, Nature, woke, SPLC, woke, ACLU, woke. This is what people want. So what's the problem if we live in a democracy and people want equity? They are certainly getting equity. They're getting equity in riots. They're getting equity in looting. They're getting equity in murders. They're getting equity in the dismantling of the meritocracy and the elimination of the SATs. They're getting equity in the doing away with the Hippocratic Oath. What's the problem? We live in a democracy. People are getting what they deserve.
Yeah.
They're getting what they want.
The issue is, are we a democracy? And I think we still are, but I know that there's many a conservative voice that would say, well, we're actually not a democracy. There's such control over social media.
Okay, that's a little conspiratorial. I mean, people.
Conspiracy. No, I don't believe there's a conspiracy going on, but there's certainly a consensus among the elites that they have the authority to declare certain forms of discourse or certain arguments out of misinformation.
I'll agree with you 100%. We agree. We have common ground. Now let's extend that a little more. Can we not agree, for example, at school boards, there are diversity, equity, and inclusion is, as far as I know, is in virtually every, if not every university in the United States of America.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not something of the elite. The people, they either want this or they don't care enough to say, I don't want this, stop it, and vote in different people.
Well,
and then you come along and you're saying, why is your work not characterized as anti-democratic?
I was just at a group of people that are sort of trying to form a dissenting group from woke ideology. And somebody was describing the sort of blue collar residents around Boston. And he said, they have no idea what we're talking about here. It's not on their radar screen. They're trying to, hold on to their jobs or save money or whatever. So the question is, the things that Mr. Lefty, you and I are aware of, either appalled by or celebrating, it's not necessarily clear that people know about it. Now, too bad for them, because they have the opportunity to learn about it. And so
They live in a democracy.
I completely agree. And I am often tempted to just throw up my hands and say, to hell with it. Why should I try and save you from yourselves if you're willing? And I especially feel this about the people within meritocratic institutions that are terrified and silent. And I'm sympathetic to them, because I'm not in one of those institutions where my job would be on the line by speaking out. But I do admit that I'm frustrated with people in the medical profession that know how awful the attack on meritocracy is, and yet they are silent. They are watching their own life work completely flush down the toilet. And so you see, like, okay, if you're willing to do this, why should I fight?
Okay. Okay. So you now have two.
I don't think you said Biden was explicit about his equity thing, and you're totally right. You're totally right. He was explicit. He ran throughout on this maudlin claim that Black parents have right to fear that their kids. On the other hand, I was stunned by when he was elected. Even conservatives said he's the voice for moderation. They talked themselves into believing that he was going to be healing our divisions and is not divisive. And I thought, what are you talking about? He has been anti-white from the moment he started running, explicitly anti-white. And yet he was portrayed by both the left and the right media as being somebody who was moderate and a healer of divisions. So that I begin to explain.
All right, Ms. McDonald, you have two choices here. You can either go with option one, which is people have been bamboozled by this ideology and they've been hoodwinked into the whole equity delusion, kind of a play off of your previous book. Or you can say that it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to figure out the fact that when you dismantle a meritocracy, you are going to have people who are not the most qualified people in certain positions. We already see that in the airline industry. We already see that in medicine, and you've written about that. You did a fantastic job in the book about that. So that to me means if you want to say option one, that's a different conversation. But I am going to argue now option two. And option two is that it is more important to people if they go for brain surgery, for example, that they do not have the best person operating on them and that they have a person who's from an oppressed minority group. I mean, people, huh?
So let me make sure. You're saying that people actually do believe that they would rather have a diverse physician than a physician who is competent.
I think if you have diversity, you cannot have both diversity and meritocracy.
I agree. That's my whole argument. But
exactly. That's exactly correct. But nobody is hiding equity. In fact, not only are they not hiding it, they're screaming it from the freaking rooftops. They're literally in every email, in every policy position, it's everywhere. No. So I can't, unless you want to say that it's somehow people live under even if you lived under a rock, you'd still hear about equity.
No.
So you want to argue option one. You want to say that people don't really understand that equity is proportional representation as you've defined it.
They understand that. What they don't understand, Mr. Lefty, and what my book does is how big the academic skills gap is. They don't understand the formula that you just gave and which I often give, which is you can have diversity or you can have meritocracy. You cannot have both. People are totally clueless about the extent of the skills gap. And so they can, these universities can go around talking about inclusive excellence. Well, you shouldn't need the inclusive if there's excellence and you're admitting on a colorblind basis, it'll become inclusive or diverse just because that's the odds. But inclusive excellence is, again, another tip off that no, we're actually put the thumb on the scales and we're junking excellence in favor of inclusivity. But I would just say that it is not the case that if people say I'm for equity, they understand the trade-off, because when I go around telling these facts,
I
started giving a trigger warning because it makes whites so uncomfortable to hear either the crime gaps or the skills gaps.
Okay, so to make sure I understand, you are claiming that because people don't realize the depth of the disparity, like if they thought that the disparity was very, very minor and very superficial, then they wouldn't think that that would manifest in a skill set of a pilot or a brain surgeon.
Right. They still believe in the thumb on the scale. I don't know if there was ever the myth of the thumb on the scale in academic admissions, which is racial preference. Just a thumb on the scale. We've got two equal candidates, and we'll just have a thumb on the scale for the female or the underrepresented minority. And I asked myself, would I mind that? Probably not, although it's always zero sum, but that I could live with. It was really truly equal. That never occurred from the very start. When Harvard started implementing racial preferences in the 1960s, it was precisely because the yawning gap between the best they could draw on in the black pool and the worst they could draw on in the white pool was so big that they needed massive preferences. So
okay, so let me change here just a little bit. So I heard my buddy Glenn Lowry, who I'm going to see this weekend for University of Austin event, speak on Jordan Peterson's podcast when he said, even if 100% of the convictions of African American men in prison are just, all of them, it is unsustainable to have a population, approximately 1/3 of whom are incarcerated or under the supervision of the criminal justice system. Even if it's justified on an individual case-by-case basis. Given that that is the case, and you don't touch on this in your book, and so perhaps this is taking us far afield, and if you think this is an unfair question, let me know. Given that that is the case, what is the prescription? I mean, prescription. So many people on my side want to abolish prisons. They want to defund the police. They and actually, there's a piece in the New York Times. Yes, we really do mean abolish defund the police. What is your solution for the people already in prison who have been committed of a crime, particularly a violent crime?
Well, that's a whole cascading set of questions. First of all,
I know.
So let me just write your final one down because I will definitely forget it by the time I get a winded answer.
Sorry.
People in prison. Okay, that's final endpoint. First of all, with all due respect, and I adore and revere Glenn Lowry, I'm just going to disagree with him. I'm sorry. I think if the fact is that 1/3 of our prison population is Black compared to a 13% Black representation, them's the facts, and we have to live with that. That is a better solution than having those people out in the community.
I think it's more than that. Sorry, I think I misspoke. It's I misspoke, but okay. But you get the high numbers. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I know the numbers. The federal and state prison population is 1/3 Black. That is less than 3 times higher than the Black population. It is true. 1/3 of all Black men have at least one felony conviction.
Yes, that's what it is. That's what it is. Yes.
Work very hard to get a felony conviction.
Yes.
Most DAs are going to want to plead that down to a misdemeanor just to get you out of the system because they're so overwhelmed by crime.
Right.
So I think that that is something we have to live with and work on the conditions. And I say we metaphorically, because frankly, I don't believe it any longer, Mr. Lefty. I think we have been trying for a very long time to eradicate these conditions. We can continue, do-gooders can continue, but at some point, it's up to the community itself to heal itself and say, we're not putting up with this BS any longer of drive-by shootings, gang involvement, drug involvement, single parenting. It's up to people in those communities to take responsibility for their own culture. So, I reject the assumption that this is something we can't live with. As far as your final question, which is what do we do with the people already there?
Yeah.
I would say this. The prisons are a scandal. American prisons are a scandal. They are dangerous, dirty, ill-kept for a large part because of diversity reasons. There's, a lot of preferences in police hierarchies as well as corrections hierarchies. There is no excuse that any prisoner should be at risk of rape or other problems, getting beaten up by gang violence in prisons, although it's a very tough population. These people are in there for a reason. Prison remains a lifetime achievement for persistence in criminal offending. You have to work very hard at your criminal record to get a judge and a prosecutor willing to send you to state or federal prison. So these are the worst of the worst. They are not pot smokers. It is hard to manage. It must be managed. And we should have them be clean and opportunities to work. It's hard logistically to do so, but they should have the ability to develop skills that will give them some shot at a productive life when they come out. Now, if you really want to be tough, Mr. Lefty, you're going to ask me about, well, what do we do with like felon disenfranchisement, or the real problem, which is alerting employers to criminal background. And that is a very, very tough issue. Or renting apartments. Do you hide the criminal conviction, or do you allow people to know what they're doing? And that is very tough. And I hope you won't press me on it.
Yeah, no, I won't. I'm trying to situate the conversation in what I think is often missing. So red, I'm out of character now. So I think what's often missing, and the problem that you and I have, is perhaps identical. I just listened to Naomi Wolf say that.
Confused, yeah.
Yeah.
Wolf is the promiscuity one, I think.
Yeah. Who was saying that, she is on the left and none of the left-wing media will talk to her. I've had this problem for years. They just won't talk to me. And so even though I've read an astonishing amount of their literature, obviously it would be far better. So this is what NPR does. When I did a series on NPR, one of the things I learned from listening to just countless hours of NPR is when they want to see what somebody on the other side says, they ask someone on their own side what someone else on the other side says. And so I am now in that extremely unfortunate situation. But the difference is NPR, all they need to do is find someone on the other side and ask them. The left, the woke left, not the left, Noam Chomsky, classical left will certainly have conversations with you. The woke left, they simply won't. So I have to it is my belief that it is incumbent upon us, rational, civilized people, philosophers in particular, to make better arguments than our opponents would make. It's kind of a Rappaport's rule thing, so that someone says, oh, wow, I wish I had, that's so clear, that's such a good argument, I wish I would have made it, because they haven't. I'm trying to do this in this conversation. I've tried, I don't know how successful I was, but one of the things that I think it comes down to is that word in your book that I spent so much time on, is equity. So you and I have I believe in the meritocracy. I'm all in on the meritocracy. I believe the purpose of the hospital should obviously be to heal people. That's why they're hospitals. I believe that the purpose of equity in general in critical social justice, equity in particular in critical social justice in general, takes an institution off of its mission statement and gives it a new mission statement under the guise of what the old mission statement was. So it's not even discharging those objectives. So where I'm going with this is, I think that what is happening at a fundamental level is two things are happening. One, there's a clash of values, right? Meritocracy versus equity. So I also disagree with your definition of equity. I don't think it's proportional representation. I think it's finding people whose ancestors have some historical oppression variable and putting more of those people in position. So I don't think it's just 13%. I think it's exponentially more than that as an equitable system, but that's okay. To have a conversation, you have to agree on some definition. So I went with you, which is fine. Doesn't make any difference. But I think it's a conflict in values. I also agree with something that you said that I've been thinking about a long time. It's that people just don't understand. Like when they hear equity, it's a, positive valence. It's a nice sounding word. Oh, equity, you have equity in your house. The house is $100,000. We have $60,000 and $6,000 equity. It's kind of a good thing. They don't understand. Nobody is arguing for diversity or equity on sports teams. I've been saying this for years. I used to think that people only wanted diversity and equity when they thought things didn't matter, like philosophy departments. We need equitable representation of, women or what have you. But I don't think that anymore. I think that this virus is so pervasive in the society. And what I'm struggling with now is, so I'll ask people. So if I ask somebody, I go around the world and I ask people these questions. If I ask somebody, would you rather live in the United States or Russia, or would you rather be ruled by the United States or Russia, or would you rather have an equitable system that takes in more minorities? If I ask them, if I put it on them, so I say, you have a choice of one of two universes. In the first universe is an equity-based system and you need brain surgery. And the second universe is an meritocratic system and you need brain surgery. Which one would you go? Most people to that will say, I'll go to the first system, an equity-based system. However, all I need to do is change one word. If I say it's your son or your daughter or someone you love, which universe would you rather go into? A merit-based system or an equity-based system? What should you rather assign them to if they need brain surgery? They will say invariably the meritocracy. Sorry, I was long-winded there.
I would say that the way we started this conversation with you being very explicit that the goal of medicine is no longer to heal people, but to be representative,
right,
and provide role models at the cost, at the expense of quality and the ability to care. I'm not sure that a lefty in most instances would ever acknowledge that that's the trade-off. I still think now one always gets, do they really believe it or not believe it? In one sense, it doesn't matter. But I'm not sure, as I said before, that people appreciate how vast the skills gaps are, so that in order to engineer proportionality or more than proportionality, how much you have to sacrifice merit.
I agree.
I think they said that. But on the other hand, sometimes a more honest argument is made, which is profoundly nihilistic, which is to deny the meaningfulness or the validity of our meritocratic tests and assessments. And so,
or to say something is more important.
No,
something
say that it doesn't, that SAT doesn't measure anything relevant.
Right.
And the real test for this would be, are you willing to go to a lottery system for admissions? Because if you really believe that the SAT or the MCATs or the LSAT measure nothing,
they're not predictive,
one's capacity to be a doctor or a lawyer or succeed in a selective school, then go to a lottery-based system and throw out any kind of objective terror. And some, we may come to that after, if the Supreme Court overturns racial preferences. But anyway, sometimes they will be honest and make a completely corrosive argument that there is actually no such thing as differences in skills or competencies.
Yeah, you used the word acknowledge before. I would also add the word admit. You said that people won't acknowledge that. So it is my belief. I don't see how, unless you're a total idiot, I do not understand how you could not see that. And again, it could, you maybe you've answered this, that they don't understand how great the disparities are. But I don't understand how you could see that saying ahead of time you're going to pick from 2% of the graduates because they're Black. How could you not understand that almost guarantees that you will not get the most qualified person? I don't even think nobody who's thought about, you don't even need to think about that for 2 seconds.
No. I know the chance of getting the most qualified is like 0.001% of that Black female judge. It's unbelievable. But again, Peter, the only way I can explain this that accords with any hope that human beings are in like 1/100th rational, as I say, just to repeat, and you just said it yourself, is they actually do not know how great the skills gaps are. And they actually do believe that skills are equally spread. one of the things I talk about in the book is just this amazing thing where anytime now, and this has been going on for decades, if a Black person doesn't get a job or a promotion, it's because of discrimination.
Right.
Inevitably, if a white person doesn't get a job or promotion, we are willing to contemplate, well, maybe you just weren't qualified. But that doesn't ever pertain to a Black person. It is always based on discrimination and racism. And that's a very hard thing to, counter, but that they immediately assume that there was no problem with skills level or competitiveness, and it's all just based on discrimination.
Yeah, maybe that's the answer. I really wish we could take Black out of this, because I really wish we could take the whole racial thing just completely out of it and present it in a neutral way to people and say, listen, here's a group that is, even doing that is difficult. I guess maybe you could do it with an imaginary group of people from some island somewhere, something like, here's a group of people who have been historically underrepresented across fields. The gap is indeed significant. We could talk about why the gap exists, but that's not the purpose of the conversation. Do you think that there should be some kind of affirmative action or some kind of equity hiring, or you'd have to watch the words you use? But I wonder if you took race out of it entirely, that
I've made that argument in order to try to just the jujitsu you're alluding to, Peter. I've taken, okay, let's not talk about race preferences, let's talk about sex preferences. And I give an example, if
right.
he admitted me with middling math SATs, and my peers all had 800 on an 800-point scale, I would struggle. And it's not because of misogyny, although that's what I would be told. It's because there was mismatch going on,
right.
Mismatch theory of Richard Sander. And that's not going to help me. I'm going to struggle and flounder, and I'll probably switch out of my STEM major, as Peter Archidiacono has shown at Duke, with major switching in Black freshmen out of STEM. So you can do it in with females. It's not, the gaps are not as great. They're the greatest at the tail ends of the distribution, which is what got Larry Summers,
right.
resigning from Harvard.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, one can take race out of it. On the other hand, at this point, as I've been saying recently, I understand the value of racial etiquette, and it would be better to not look at these very, very difficult truths that make Americans, especially white Americans, incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The hour is late.
I agree.
I am not going to give a whole lot of deference to racial etiquette when what is happening in the name of fighting phony, fake racism is tearing down every civilizational standard and things that I truly love and cherish.
I agree. And I want to thank you for having the role play with me today. I appreciate it. And I loved your book. I thought it was fantastic. And you're a good sport. You're a good sport today. So thank you. Where can people find your book, and where can people find you?
Oh, thank you, Peter. Well, I don't even know my Twitter handle. I do have a Twitter account, but it's a weird handle. So if you just Google Heather McDonald on Twitter, that will take you to my account.
And it's sort of MacDonald, M-A-C Donald.
Yeah, who knows? It's very weird. Okay. But that gives you sort of a recent rundown of appearances and writing stuff. And then the book is just wherever you buy books, whether you go to an actual physical bricks and mortar thing, if they still exist, or online.
Well, thank you. And it was really good to see you. Hopefully I'll see you again in person soon.